one of the things that has really been striking me, so in my role, I'm on the board of the Nature Conservancy. The Nature Conservancy, like many conservation organizations, has had a big private sector engagement. And some of you may have read an article in the New Yorker that was basically following Mark Tursick, who's the head of the Nature Conservancy, around. And a lot of this was about the corporate engagement that TNC has with Dow Chemical Corporation. And it just raised in my mind, and through the TNC and dealing with Dow and a number of other corporate conservation partnerships that have sprung up, it's this question of what is the role of the private sector, of corporations, in conservation and in the environment more generally. So one can think about corporations obviously have a duty to their shareholders to make money, but what about the wider role of corporations with the environment? And so we have a panel here who is, I joked with them when I sent out an email, this was my dream team of people to discuss this issue, because these are three people who have all thought deeply about this kind of what's the role of the private sector and the environment and conservation, and have done so actually with a number of hats on. So for example, Amy is with Pentair now, but she was with Conservation International in the past. Chris, you're currently at Columbia, but you've also had, you've been at Target and Excel Energy. And Mosaic. So, Jay, and I've worked with you a number of times in a number of issues where we've been dealing with Excel and a number of other corporations. So, I'm going to turn this over, and I've asked each of our three panelists to start with some thoughts, but then we're going to turn it over to you, because I imagine that also you will have a lot of questions, and so hopefully we'll have a very rich dialogue on this topic. So I'm going to turn it over to Amy.
All right, can you guys hear me? So as Steve mentioned, this has been a question that has really defined my 20-year career. So I'm currently the Vice President of Corporate Social Responsibility for Pentair, which is a big industrial company here in the cities. But I'm really here today as a person and as an individual. And that's because this question has been one that I've thought about for 20 years or more. I started my career at Conservation International back in the days when environmentalists and the private sector didn't talk to each other, at least not civilly. And so CI, Environmental Defense Fund, those organizations were amongst the first to actually kind of reach across the aisle, as it were, and start saying, to achieve what we want to achieve from a conservation standpoint, we're going to have to involve the private sector, and we better figure out a way to engage with them positively rather than just shouting at each other across the way. So I spent 13 years at CI. We created actually a center of excellence around engaging the private sector, got a big grant to do that, called the Center for Environmental Leadership in Business. And our theory of change at the time was, let's hit the big industries that have big impacts on the things that CI cared about, which was biodiversity and human well-being, and let's target those industries and look for some leaders, and then the industry will follow the leader. So we worked on agriculture and had partnerships with Starbucks. We worked on forestry and had partnerships with International Paper. We worked on energy and mining and convened many of the big energy companies to think about how they did what they did in a better way. And it was really positive. And I did it for 13 years, so obviously there was some value to it. But then I actually started asking myself two questions. Was our theory of change working? In other words, if you get the big companies that are brand names to you and me to change their practices, does the rest of the industry that we don't necessarily see or touch or feel follow along? And was industry out-innovating us at our own game? And so both the answers to those questions actually led me to very purposefully leave the conservation world. And I actually said, okay, innovation is the name of the game. Companies have gotten as good or better than environmentalists at figuring out how to do the sustainability stuff. So I went to Silicon Valley. And I was eBay's first sustainability director. And there was the traditional kind of energy, wastewater, managing the footprint. But what I was really interested in was, one, learning how a Valley company thought and iterated and learned to fail and learn and fail again, which was not something I thought the nonprofit sector was super well equipped to do. And then the second thing was to think about changing paradigms. So if you think about eBay, it's a different type of marketplace where peers are selling and buying from each other rather than having an intermediary. And so I spent 5 years at eBay before our family moved to the Twin Cities, and I feel like learned a lot about kind of the importance of rapid iteration and innovation and thinking about the systems and blowing up the systems and questioning them. And then landed here in the cities when my family moved here, and have now been for about 18 months with Pentair, really thinking about large-scale water, food, energy nexus questions. Pentair's business touches all of those issues in pretty significant ways. And I guess the question that I ask myself is, where is impact going to come from? And I'm no longer thinking that environmentalists and corporations or brands, and let's purposely call them brands, are strange bedfellows any longer. But I'm not sure that the follow the leader principle works anymore either. In other words, we have a handful of 20 companies that we could all name that have made part of their brand promise being responsible, and they're doing interesting and good things. But what about the other multitudes of companies that you and I don't know their names but are at work? What's it going to take to influence their behavior and change the system that they operate in? Are we creating a two-tier system in which certain brands are using this as part of, to their advantage, but we're not actually making any impact on the issues that really matter? And I don't have an answer, but I do have a lot of questions around that.
Great.
Hopefully this will stand out. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jay Drake Hamilton, and I am with a St. Paul-based firm that is a non-governmental organization called Fresh Energy. And we work throughout the state, the region, and the country on policies, smart policies, that will embed in them the core values that so many Minnesotans hold dear. What we're trying to do is move this state and this nation to an energy and transportation system that is cleaner, more efficient, more cost-effective, and that benefits all of us and all beings. And it's a big challenge. So I thought I would speak today, use my time to talk about this major environmental and humanitarian crisis of our time and the time of kids growing up today, which is, of course, climate change and global warming, which is what I spend most of my time doing at Fresh Energy. And it's, we don't typically tag ourselves as environmentalists, because the way we do our work, we're definitely energy and climate policy geeks. But we would never be successful or have hopes of success if we just stayed within a think tank without reaching out. And so all of the time, what we are trying to do is work to forge and build partnerships that will help the state and the country move toward cleaner energy policy. And we do this thoughtfully. Currently, we have a number of businesses that we ally with, some more formally, some more informally, depending on the policy issues that we're trying to move forward jointly. And so it's very much a cooperative effort, and it's based on having common goals. And when you think about climate change and global warming, what you're thinking about is not only in individual companies or institutions' carbon footprint, but of course getting to the point where we can think about seriously decarbonizing the economy well before the end of this century. And what are all of the building blocks that we need to make that happen? What are the standards we need to achieve? And what are the behaviors that need to change in order to make that possible? So nothing would be possible without partnerships. Specifically when we talk about energy, and sometimes I get into dialogues with this with some of our donors at Fresh Energy, who are, some of whom come to us from a very personal perspective, that they are trying to take their carbon footprint to zero. They're trying to be a leader in their family and their community. And they're sometimes wondering, why haven't they heard more from their utility company about what they can do to save energy or what they can do to get to clean energy? There's a long history to that we can talk about during the Q&A, but I also remind them that for most of Minnesotans, the energy that's produced by an electric company, 2/3 of that is for commercial and industrial customers. And so it is not for residential customers. So in addition to all of those great households who are trying to do their very best and are spurred on by great passion and a lot of thorough research in doing so, we also need to get to the other 2/3. And in fact, when you go and meet with the decision makers who make these choices going forward on behalf of all of us, they're very interested in what businesses think. Now, businesses, of course, are not by any means a monolith. And although I would say that in every venue we're at trying to move policy, businesses are present. Most often it's in the form of the state chamber, sometimes just of one electric utility as the business in the room. It's by no means a gathering of business interests that really reflects the diversity of businesses that have made this state and this country so great. So we need to expand that franchise, and we need to work together in order to get these big reductions that we know are needed. Now, there's definitely a role for regulation. We are in a regulated utility system here in Minnesota, and so we have regulated monopolies for the most part for our utilities, and those regulations are great, and we at Fresh Energy work all the time to help inform the regulators at the Public Utilities Commission who manage those relationships. But we're also at a time of what many people have called a seismic shift in the utility business model that was very static for several generations, many generations. And this was about, if we had a utility person here, that person would probably begin his or her talk, as we often begin our talks. We're interested in reliable, affordable, universal electricity generation. I'm interested in that too. So is Fresh Energy. Reliability, affordability, universality, all critically important. And that portfolio has to get increasingly clean and efficient, and has to do that much sooner rather than later going forward. So those things are all very, very important going forward. But now we're at a point in time where the costs of several very important technologies, specifically wind and solar energy, are reaching a point where they can compete in certain markets and circumstances with fossil fuels. And these tend to be and can often be decentralized technologies. So they're very different than the old paradigm of how electric utilities work. So times are changing. And it's going to be very interesting to see which utilities are smart enough and innovative enough. And I hope a lot of those are based in Minnesota because we need them to be smart and innovative, to grasp onto those changing economics and circumstances, and to read the poll numbers of what their customers want. And 80 to 90% of their customers in Minnesota want their next electron to come from solar energy or wind, or especially energy efficiency. And only 25% of their customers want it to come from burning coal. There's a mandate there. And I hope they're also reading the tea leaves that are now usually on the front page of the paper every day, and very much in the media, which is that Americans, there's just a poll that came out, 75% of Americans embrace the Clean Power Plan that the Obama administration has put forward, the first ever limits on carbon pollution from coal-burning power plants. So they want the federal government to act. And if you delve deeper in the polling, which the pollsters have done, they want state governments to act. In other words, they want action. They want not just leadership from a few corporations and a few governments in a few states, but they want real action, and they've come to expect it and demand it going forward. So the smarter businesses are going to be the ones that work together not only with conservation groups, environmental groups, the clean energy sector, but also with financiers and with the utility companies to build the new business model, which will get us much lower carbon at a very low cost.
Chris, turn it over to you.
Thanks. So my name is Chris Lambe. I'm currently with Columbia University and with the Earth Institute, but I have worked as a corporate responsibility officer, chief sustainability officer for 3 large local companies, for Exxon Energy, for Target, and most recently for Mosaic, which is a large agricultural company. So I have, like the previous 15 years of my career were very much in this area. And I did see some quantum changes during those 15 years. Like I can tell you that around 2000, if you went into any large corporation anywhere in America, with the exception of 1 or 2, the word sustainability was hardly ever even used. And even 3-4 years later, sustainability was just about producing a report and nothing else. Now you'd go in, and I would say that like you've got companies who are surveying their own employees and asking them, what are your views on sustainability? So it's not just a for consumer strategy, it's very much an internal employee engagement strategy and wanting to actually engage all their stakeholders. So there has been a quantum change, and I think that it's important to recognize that, because I would argue that the larger Fortune 5 companies have changed more than the general population has, and have changed certainly a lot more than government has. So if you're looking at the 3 big sectors, large companies have made some quantum changes. For example, if you just look at the Kyoto protocols from the early 90s, most companies back at the time opposed Kyoto to an unbelievable extent, but yet voluntarily they've probably exceeded most of those old Kyoto targets. So the first thing I would say is we need to give credit where credit is due. However, are we there? By no means are we there. Too often, it's just one visionary CEO. One CEO comes in and makes quantum changes, they're replaced, the next CEO simply doesn't share the same views, and things fall back. A CEO or senior executives might be extremely engaged, but you actually try to get something really done and middle management just completely blocks you. So there are still, most of the low-hanging fruit, I think, has already been picked. And companies have gone out and said, I need to do something on this, what can I do? So they've done things that don't cost too much, or they've done things that really matter for a certain group of stakeholders. Really true, profound change has yet to occur. And why is that? I genuinely don't believe it's because senior management of companies don't want to change. They're smart people. They're getting briefings from people like Amy on a pretty regular basis. But they are somewhat restrained in what they're able to do. You have an investor community that is completely focused on quarterly earnings and short-term profits. And you have a CEO receiving information 10 times a day on how we're going to be doing in our next quarterly earnings and how investors are going to react. And then you go in and you're trying to talk to them about a 10-year project, something that's going to cost quite a bit of money now, and we're not going to see true returns on it for 10 years' time. Well, it's very, very difficult for CEOs or human beings to balance these two very, very difficult and opposing forces. And a lot of people ask me, can environmental NGOs and companies get along and continue to get along? I think a much more pertinent question is, can environmental NGOs and the truly influential investor class get along? Because companies are completely reliant on what their investors want. And it's not really the consumer investor, it's not you or I in our 401ks, it's not even some relatively small institutions, it's the very, very large institutional investors pretty much hold all the cards now. If they're not willing to take some small hit on quarterly earnings and try to truly understand, like not just pay lip service to, long-term resource security, then long-term profits are going to be greatly impacted. There's only there's a limited number of resources in the world. How we manage those is greatly going to affect how we grow. And if we don't manage those resources correctly, we're going to be in trouble with long-term profits. Now, it can be very easy to make an energy solution, or even a carbon argument sometimes in a company. At Mosaic, the company I just recently left, in the year 2000, the predecessors of that company were pretty much the largest power users in the state of Florida. They use more electricity than anybody else. By 2020, I would say the company will be very close to being off-grid. So in a 20-year period, you go from being a massive power user to somebody who's actually pumping power back onto the grid. And most of that was achieved through capturing waste heat in the industrial operations, turning that waste heat into electricity and using that electricity internally, exporting some to the grid. All of that, what that did was, there was obviously some capital investment up front, but after the capital investment was paid off, suddenly you've got way reduced energy bills. So the company saved a lot of money by taking emissions out of the air. So those kind of win-win propositions are frequent. We could probably sit here and mention another 20 companies that have done similar things. And there are a growing number of investors who are beginning to think this way. There's an organization called the Carbon Disclosure Project, which has got 550 or 600 institutional investors who are signing on to ask companies to not just report their carbon reduction emissions, but also their thinking behind carbon reduction, their thinking behind climate change, their policy positions. They even want to know, like, how much money are you investing? And there's some pressure coming on companies from a certain group of institutional investors. But there's an equally large or even larger group of institutional investors who just don't care. So in many ways, I think this debate could often be reframed around how are we going to get NGOs and large institutional investors working together, because if they work together well, companies will simply flow in behind.
Great, thanks. So I'd actually, building on all of your remarks, I'd like to pose one question for you. And Chris, just building off of what you just said, I mean, I think of this sometimes as there's sort of three levels here. One is sort of the easy things, the win-wins. You know, there are things which are good for the company's bottom line if they would think it through. You know, so resource savings, you know, the energy savings that you did. So, you know, how do we make those win-wins actually happen? And are there some systematic ways of doing that? Then there's the slightly harder things, which are sort of short-term, long-term. We talked about, you know, the finance community having a sufficiently long-term view. Paul Pullman of Unilever basically just said, we're not interested in producing quarterly reports, and if you're interested in quarterly reports, invest somewhere else.
Yes.
So, how do we think about this kind of things which are still profitable for the company, but maybe have a long time horizon, maybe beyond what investors have patience for? And then the third, I think of as the really hard, which is public goods. I mean, there are things which don't necessarily show up as profitable, as typically figured given our current pricing system, but have a public benefit that go well beyond what the company does, and the role of companies in providing those public goods. So anyway, I would throw it open to any of you, and you can take either the easy or the really hard ones.
I'll make one comment on that, Steve. I think there's some really good questions. One thing which I think is often greatly underestimated in being an obstacle for true success in companies is how busy middle management is. This is a really simple, practical question. Now, I think many people are aware of statistics that, you know, the corporate worker is way more efficient now than they were, say, in like 1970. They're basically doing twice as much work. And a lot of this has been driven by, you know, cutting expenses, cutting costs, and making people more productive. But there's a price to that, and the price is thought. Middle managers don't have the time to think, just to actually be able to sit back and think. So I'm a sustainability officer. I'm going in to, say, a vice president running a certain area of the company. And I want to run some ideas past them on some low-hanging fruit, some things that I see. That person has just had meeting, presentation, super stressed, having great difficulties keeping up with their day-to-day work. And now I'm going in asking them to stop and think in a completely different way than they've ever thought before about how they do something. I'm asking them to change systems that have been in place for 30, 40, 50 years. And what they go is like, oh my God. The head goes back. It's a shock. It's not that I don't agree with you, Chris. I just can't think of that right now. Well, when would be a good time? Well, I'm going to retire in a few years. That is a very, very human condition. It's very, very real. And very often, these issues we're talking about, they seem like they're big policy issues. They often boil down to the simplest of human equations. So that is an obstacle I'm not sure how to get around, because nobody's going to lighten that person's workload. And until they do, that person isn't going to necessarily have the time to think through the equation. And so many great ideas die on the vine, never make it up to the CEO. Because you can't just go to the CEO and go, hi, Chief Sustainability Officer here, I got a great idea. You know, you've got to go in and go, I've talked to the business people, I've talked to these people, we've got a consensus, we've got a plan for you. And if you don't have that, it's not going to go anywhere. So I think in addition to talking about these major policy things and major movements, we have to consider these small human interactions as well.
That made me think of a reality when I was at eBay. I joined the company in the beginning of 2008 at the beginning of the financial meltdown with a mandate to do great sustainability things across the company within its operations, but also with our employees and with our customers. And yet, I mean, you want to talk about folks that were on overload. Try running a brand that was flailing in the midst of the recession in Silicon Valley in 2008. One of the things that we had to do, and this was really new to me coming out of the conservation world, was absolutely reframe what we thought had to happen from a sustainability standpoint into solving an immediate business problem. And so for several years, my strategy at eBay was not to say, what do I think eBay needs to be doing or what's the right thing for the environment, as much as it was to say, what are the business problems that our company is facing? Sustainability isn't just a line of work, it's a way of thinking. It's a way of viewing the world in a different way. So when we actually started viewing some of the problems with the lens of sustainability, whether it was around the fact that the company had a challenge with the kinds of materials people were using to ship you, the buyers, the precious china that you bought, it would show up in a cereal box and that didn't actually reflect the value of the china because people were having to source that from their own house, or whether it was the problem of electronic waste and turning that into a business opportunity. What we did was say, how do you say, okay, here's our business needs, here's how sustainability, a lens of that, a thinking about that, a thinking about the systems is going to impact and solve one of those business challenges. It didn't make it less work for anybody. We still had people that were on overload and trying to prioritize this, but I could get things farther up the food chain, if you will, of prioritization when it was a different way of looking at a problem that someone's manager had already identified rather than an additional item on their to-do list. And that's something that I think that the environmental community, the policy community, academia, and business could do a much better job of doing, is actually saying, where does all of this come together and solve problems that we have? And I think it could go the other way. I think business could be asking, what environmental challenges are in our business interests to solve as well. So it's not just kind of one-sided.
Yeah, let's talk about a big public good. What if this country had a limit on carbon pollution across the economy that would drive down pollution and grow all of the fossil fuel replacements that we need in a way that is going to maximize economic good for as many people as possible. We can't do that without businesses. I mentioned that they're they have these huge carbon footprints that can't be addressed unless they take into account a policy way. We're a nation of laws. We're going to do that through laws. And like it or not, businesses have a disproportionate sway on policymakers at all levels. Too often the businesses, I've already said, that are in front of policymakers are just a very small snapshot of businesses when we're talking about big public goods like carbon. It's you might call them self-interested businesses, the clean tech companies, and certainly the old-fashioned companies like some of the electric utilities are in the room, the Chamber of Commerce is in the room. But we need a way to get the messages that some business leaders, some corporations are already making massive investments that are really growing green energy, clean energy technologies, really cutting carbon, that start to get us around the too long held notion that this is a niche market, that it's too slow, it won't ramp up quickly enough. But we do need those stories to get out to policymakers in effective ways. Policymakers are no different than the rest of human beings. We communicate through stories. And so there is a great role for the right actors within academic institutions and NGOs to translate those stories. We already see it happening a little bit when there's a new data center that's powered by a big solar farm in Iowa that's in the news. That communications person for that company is smart enough to know to use social math and to talk about how much bigger this is than any other solar farm in Iowa, or how much it's driving, effectively how many cars it's taking off the road. But we need those stories to appear, not just when there's an opening of business and not just when a law is a bill is being debated. We need consistent messaging from the right messengers. Very rarely is the environmental community the right messenger, but we know lots of people who are great messengers. We know, and some of them are right here at the University of Minnesota and in companies around the state of Minnesota going forward. So we need to demonstrate that big things are happening, and then we need a trajectory that shows that scaling up to where we actually need it to be. One of the reasons why policies have not moved forward in the United States on carbon, except from the administrative level, is when things were debated in past Congresses, that was when people would try to get various CEOs to write commentaries in the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times. And sometimes those things happened, but they were way too little and far too late. And instead what we need is that this to become part of a public dialogue. And here are 2 hooks I think that I've seen recently to make this part of the public dialogue, but then it's incumbent on all of us to get those discussions going with the people who are making the decisions, both in companies and at the government level. First, about 6 months ago, the Risky Business Report came out and got front page coverage here because corporate leaders at Cargill were part of the Risky Business Report. So this is the idea that many corporations now acknowledge and are trying to deal with, that unabated climate change is going to be risky to their very business propositions. It's already causing more storm damage, it's impacting water availability, water quality, and of course energy costs. And so what the newsworthiness of that was that it was big companies, including a big agribusiness company like Cargill. So what do we do with that going forward? That Minnesota innovation and leadership going forward. And secondly, also touched on a Minnesota company. The way things get in the news here in Minnesota is if there's a Minnesota angle. And when the World Wildlife Fund realized their goal, I think they worked for about 2 years on it, working with 3M to provide not only all 3M employees, but also particularly their friends and family with access to the ability to figure out whether on their rooftop they could do solar energy and whether they could afford to buy that solar energy, and making use of the big market that is a large number of employees and a centralized kind of service. I know I got a lot of calls from our donors at Fresh Energy when that came out, because a lot of people in Minnesota know someone who works for 3M or was wondering, why their company isn't doing it. And what I would challenge people to do, and the Fresh Energy model for this is, rather than it just be one big corporate perk, let's try to figure out how do we make this possible for everyone in Minnesota, because most of us do not work for 3M, most of us work for fairly small companies. And it's something that would be good for everyone. And so the answer to that is, of course, in a nation of laws, that you have a policy and standard that make it easier and more practical for everyone to investigate their solar energy potential and realize that, and other ways for them to become solar investors. So we're all part of this economy. So in other words, democratizing solar. So it may seem ironic to talk about, in a business panel, to talk about democratizing solar, but the reason why solar technologies and wind have become so much more enticing is all because of economics, and we have a large debt of gratitude to the nations of Germany and Japan for making that possible, for making these discussions we're having here in Minnesota, landlocked, very cold, not a pretty good solar resource, but we're no Arizona, making this possible because the prices have come down so far. And so, but the 3M decision, the Risky Business Report, the interaction with the World Wildlife Fund, I bet there are a lot of people in the room who have, at some time or another, have given money to a group like the World Wildlife Fund. It opens up the possibility for more discussions, practical discussions about what is possible here in Minnesota going forward. So it's not a dream world, it doesn't require action by Congress, but thinking about how we can, in a state like Minnesota, lead the rest of the nation and be the first to do these things.
All right, I think we're ready to take some questions from the audience. If you'll please wait till you get the talking stick, and that would be great. We'll start in the back.
Yeah, I think we may be entering, through necessity, kind of a golden age of collaboration. For a long time, climate change has been, an idea or a threat. I think a lot of people will tell you now that they see it with their own bare eyes. Water scarcity is going to be a huge issue in the next 10, 15 years. I think the projections by 2030, we're going to have a 30 to 40% global shortfall based upon population growth and use. So we are going to live through an era of resource scarcity. You've already seen companies who use a lot of water, like Coke or Pepsi, relocate bottling plants from one nation to another, from one area to another, because they can see 10 years down the line they're not going to have any water. So just through the pure necessity of resource scarcity and population growth, I think we are going to be presented with opportunities to change. A number of, Hurricane Katrina type events will raise public consciousness. Famine, droughts in part of Africa because of changing rainfall patterns. It could be, I'm originally from Ireland, and we're getting a lot more water than we ever got before, and Ireland certainly wasn't short of rain traditionally, but we seem to be getting quite a lot of California's rain. So even in places that aren't necessarily what you would regard as hubs of industrialization, the effects are there. So I think simply because the opportunities are going to exist, collaboration will become possible, and will just become a lot deeper. Because we'll actually be able to look and see the problem rather than it being simply an abstract report.
Let me just give a concrete example of exactly what Chris is talking about, especially in the water space. California, this is one that hits deep and dear to my heart because it's a product that's deep and dear to my heart. California wine country. Their California policy provides enough water to grow the grapes in California wine country. But there are wine growers that don't have enough water to process the grapes. You basically have to have water to wash down the tanks in between batches and create the sanitary conditions so that it can go in the bottle. I think it is going to happen around water. I think it's happening today. I don't even know that it's 10 or 15 years down the line. And I think that you're actually going to see business and society competing for resources that are today considered public goods and are so vastly mispriced as public goods. We're either going to end up in dystopia where business militarizes and takes the resources it needs, or we're going to have to figure out how do you get water to the people that need it, to the businesses that need it, to the agricultural communities, and actually shift the system. So in that case, doing water efficiency when your water withdrawals are flat or limited is no longer in any of the categories that Steve mentioned. It's actually in the fourth category of survival.
I'm going to give you a tangible example from here in Minnesota, and part of it is, Chris mentioned opportunities, and some of it is the opportunities, in our experience with policy, a lot of it is opportunities that people in this community create. You make openings for yourself, and we had an example of that. We got to work with Dr. Polasky and his students over the last year on a question of internalizing externalities. And just to give you a little bit of background, we're in a state that has rate-regulated utilities. You may have seen on the front page of newspapers that there have been very large nuclear cost overruns, double the cost for nuclear plant modernization in Minnesota. And the jury is still out about whether the state of Minnesota will allow the utility involved to pass along those costs, an extra $300 million to ratepayers, most of whom, as I've said, are businesses in Minnesota, or whether that will be taken up by the shareholders. So we'll see in the next year how that plays out. But that should trigger an opportunity for those businesses to figure out how is it that we can question those regulatory decisions that are being made about vast expenditures of money going forward. So I don't want to talk about nuclear power, I want to talk about coal power, because many companies, including prominent ones in Minnesota, utility companies, are recognizing that there's a carbon cost that is a risk to their very business foundation. And so they are taking very proactive steps to write down that risk and make sure that they're minimizing those carbon costs. But they are also typically the owners of power plants that are 30 and 40 and 50 years old. that are going to require, regardless of carbon, are going to require hundreds of millions of dollars of investment over the next couple of years just to meet other environmental standards. And don't just think about throwaway environmental standards. These are the environmental standards like ozone and regional haze and smog standards that kill people. They're there to prevent the killing of people. So they're health-based standards. So the question of whether those decisions will be made and what are the factors under consideration is something we took on at Fresh Energy with our lawyers at the Minnesota Center for Environmental Advocacy in the last 15 months. And we were building on a law that was actually the first policy that Fresh Energy was successful in getting passed. It happened in 1992. And it is simply a requirement that as Minnesota plans for how they are going to allow or disallow big investments in big power plants going forward, whether they're going to require customers to pay for those, they need to look at the socioeconomic costs of those investments going forward, including things like health and environmental costs. That's a groundbreaking statute. Our lawyers can't find another like it in the United States. So Minnesota has that statute. We haven't updated those values, though, since 1997. So think in the world of research that a lot of, whatever field of research you're in, we're in a university crowd, what if the information had not been updated since 1997? What if no peer review articles had been published since 1997 and you were just working with that status of your field? Of course, that would be ridiculous. That's not science-based, and that's actually what our public utilities said. And they said, we're going to move forward in 2015 and update those health and environmental costs of coal-fired power plants. So on Tuesday, an administrative law judge is going to set out a schedule for that and begin taking public comment on that going forward. And so what that will mean is that if we are successful, Minnesota will update its values to reflect reality. And instead of having us pay the health costs of burning coal on our health care bills, or in lost work days or lost school days because of asthma attacks, we will be paying the costs. We won't be paying the costs because as we decide whether to make those future investments or not, we'll be weighing those costs properly and we'll get better decisions going forward. So it's an example of a public good where we've created an opportunity. I hope that it will be fully realized because it will impact every regulated utility in the state. I know when we first passed that provision, and it was a bipartisan vote in favor of it, by the way. I got calls from our colleagues from around the country who said, this is great what you've done in Minnesota, and we'll start working on that this year in X state. And I said, well, you better first pass that law, because it's the law, again, nation of laws, that is the underpinning. But it's an opportunity for astute businesses who are all paying energy bills and who, many of whom are going to be increasingly pressured and encouraged, not just by the investors, but by their customers, to get to a lower carbon product, to begin asking those questions or to ask them in the right forums of their electric utilities, what they're doing to better prepare to minimize that business risk going forward.
I don't know if the model is at war with the Earth, and I do sometimes have difficulty with some of the inflammatory language used by both sides, just because I think it actually limits our abilities to agree on things. And I think there's a lot of fear-mongering, which is not very productive. But at the same time, I understand where she's coming from, because capitalism at its root has come to expect continual and never-ending growth. But all growth is based upon resources. So if you look around this room, everything in this room, from the carpet to the clothes on your back, came from somewhere. Well, we're still going to have 9 billion people on the planet. There's only so many resources. We've in fact depleted a lot of the easily accessible resources. You can't have never or ever expanding growth if you have resource constraints. So those two things are going to collide, for sure. So I completely agree with her on that point. we're going to have to rethink how we view growth and how we want to grow. It's not that we can't continue to grow our economy, but we're not going to be able to grow our economy in traditional ways anymore. It simply can't be fire off another widget that's made out of X metal that's suddenly running out. The basic cost will just mess with your supply and demand curves. So yes, I agree with her, but I think there's I know she probably has to be a little bit more inflammatory to sell books, but I would love if we could all regulate as individuals our desire for the inflammatory and to really look at things with a more balanced, in a more cold and a less emotional way, and simply understand that this is all our problems. We want goods and services. We need some level of economic growth for our free market system to survive. But capitalism is overly reliant on what some might say excessive growth, and we have to try to create some balance. If we all work for that balance together, and I think a lot of the solutions may even be consumer-based, then I think we may have a future.
I want to make sure we get some more questions in too before the end of the time, but I guess I'll just say, I think those of us that sit here in the US in positions of relative privilege, with warm clothes and shelter and food and all of our basic needs met and eating whatever we choose to eat, need to think hard about the equity questions in these kinds of rhetorical statements as well. We have 7 billion people going to 9 billion people. We have 1 billion people that are going to go to 3 billion in terms of the growing middle class. And all that people on Earth want is kind of the basics of what we some have, shelter, available protein, energy to read by at night, running water, a toilet. So when we think about how are we going to meet the needs of our growing population, and especially those people that aspire to what we, each and every one of us in this room have, we need to think about what's the equitable way of getting there, what's the systemic way of getting there, and not, and be careful not to say, since we've gotten what we need and want, therefore we have to create a new system that doesn't provide that for others. Personally, deeply, I believe that there is some truth to exactly what Chris was saying in terms of unrestrained, unchecked, unbalanced capitalism and growth. At the same time, it seems to be the system that has worked and raised people's standard of living across the world. So I guess the question is, how can those of us who are all part of that system put demands within the system of what's acceptable and what's not to us?
And I haven't read Naomi Klein's book yet, though it's on my reading list, so I can't speak to it in detail. But if by Earth she's talking about also human beings, I would agree with her. And I think we're really at war with our kids, effectively. And the decision I put on the table before that's coming up in 2015 in Minnesota is now based on a generation-old law, which says simply, before you make a $400 million or so investment in a coal plant, you need to look at the side-by-side cost comparison, all of the costs versus all of the costs, doing it one way or doing it the other way. Once we update those values, they are going to include climate damage values outside Minnesota caused by that coal plant in Minnesota. So we have something very tangible that I think will help put us more in a leadership position and help us make better decisions. And it's something that many people we've talked to in the business community get, because you're talking about a side-by-side cost comparison and you're making sure that you have as many costs as possible in the equation so that you're getting a better decision and you're no longer throwing good money after bad.
Well, think about that for a business opportunity. You're right. Small enterprises don't have the ability to do their own research, do their own planning, or maybe even raise their own finances. But basic solutions are relatively simple, relatively widely available. What about small consultancy companies that can go into a small business and go, let me completely reevaluate your energy profile for you and help you make some changes? Maybe even some state grants to get them off the ground. So there's in a new economy, there'll be so many opportunities for young people coming out of college to go and start their own companies to bring these services down. And since we know that most millennials don't want to work for big companies anyway, it's a perfect career path.
I have a quick question to maybe wrap up here too, and bring it back to the title of the session, Environmentalists and Corporations Make Strange Bedfellows. I just want to ask you all just quickly, what's your take on that word, environmentalist? There was a study recently showing that millennials think that they really care about the environment, but they hate that word because it's the old versus new environmentalism. So what's your take on that word, environmentalist?
I hate all the isms and ists. I do. Capitalist, socialist, I hate them all because they put people in boxes, and people aren't in boxes, they've little bits and pieces of them all. So I really agree with the millennial generation on trying to get rid of that. To me, one of the biggest problems is a lot of the environmental groups think about one issue. It's water, it's carbon, it's something else. Whereas companies and the people they're trying to impact have a myriad of issues. So the nexus and how issues relate to each other are not being addressed. And very often, you do work in one area and it damages another. So understanding the connectivity, I think companies are beginning to get there. I think environmental groups have a bit of a ways to go to get that connectivity.
I would just maybe quibble with Chris a little bit. I think both sets have a ways to go, because I'm not interested in your approach or my approach. I'm interested in what is the vision? Where are we trying to get to? And we need a lot less isolation and siloing between the sectors. Instead, we need to figure out what is the vision we want. And the vision can't be represented as clean water necessarily just by itself, but it also can't be just profits. That's not really a vision. And so it's not really full-fledged, and we need help from academic institutions figuring out what is that vision, and then in measuring and charting a course for getting there.
I guess I would just add to both of those. To me, it's a question of how do you get the best from each sector in a collaboration? What is it that each sector brings to the table that's their best strength? And then how do you put it all together in a bigger picture, rather than kind of what the terms ists and isms imply of you are good at something and therefore you have an outcome that you are driving towards. I don't think all businesses are only just profits, and I don't think all environmentalists are just water for water's sake, but how do you get the best from each of them to create a systemic change?
Please thank our panelists.